Okay, well, welcome to the Forum at Friendship. So good to have all of you here for this program tonight with Dr. Amy Moore, coming to us from the Bay Area in California. And she will be speaking on the subject of the science of COVID-19. What do we know? Let me just tell you a little bit about Amy here. As Director of Science and Research for the GO2 Foundation, Dr. Amy Moore combines her expertise as a trained virologist and cancer researcher with over a decade of nonprofit experience to help advance the foundation's science initiatives. Amy has become a sought-after expert and has participated in over a dozen webinars, panel discussions, podcasts, and print interviews about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on the lung cancer community. She earned a PhD in microbiology and immunology from Wake Forest University School of Medicine and was a postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt, Vanderbilt University Medical Center, where she studied molecular mechanisms of acute leukemia development. Amy also earned a professional certificate in research administration from Georgia State University, where she was in the first graduating class of the Executive Leadership Academy for Women. Besides all of that, Amy is a dear, dear friend of mine. Her family she comes from a wonderful family. She is part of a wonderful family who I greatly miss and would love to visit out in California one of these days. So Amy, welcome. So good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so great to be with all of you. And I miss Georgia. I still have family there. My husband is actually from Georgia and did undergrad and most of his PhD at UGA. My mother-in-law and her husband live in Madison, so very close to you all. And my father-in-law and his wife live down in St. Simons. And so most of the family's there. I'm originally from Pickens, South Carolina, in the upstate, and went to Furman for undergrad.
Oh, Amy, I'm sorry. I muted you. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I muted you by accident.
Yep.
Sorry.
So my Southern roots are very strong. I miss my Georgia friends and family, and I'm anxious to get back there as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So it's good to be with you.
All right. Well, tonight, we are going to conduct this event you think of it as 5 chapters, 5 stages. And Amy is going to do some presenting, but then she'll also field questions from all of you on each of 5 different areas. First area that we'll talk about tonight is coronavirus myths versus realities. Myth versus reality. That's step 1. The second area will be testing strategies. Third area, treatments. Fourth area, vaccine development. And fifth, when are we going back to normal? Okay, and that's when she's going to pull out her prognostication hat and do that. So let's get started. Let's get started with myth versus reality. Amy, what are the myths about COVID and what are the realities?
Well, I want to back up just a little bit and make sure that we're all kind of on the same playing field of our understanding of what we're dealing with and how all of this started, and don't want to make any assumptions about our basic understanding of virology and what viruses are. So, COVID-19 is the disease caused by a novel respiratory virus called SARS-CoV-2, which is a member of the coronavirus family. So it's a unique type of virus that was first discovered in China in late 2019. So hence the COVID-19, which means coronavirus disease, COVID. So they tried to give it a name that didn't, there are several members of the coronavirus family. So, you may have heard of some of the other sister viruses that caused some major problems before. There are four kind of naturally circulating coronaviruses, which don't cause much problem, and we don't hear about them very much. And they have a weird combination of letters and numbers that don't really make any sense to us. But then you heard about SARS, which, kind of exploded onto the scene in Southeast Asia in 2002, 2003. And then it kind of eventually petered out and just went away. Then there was another member of the family, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS, that you may have heard about, that also caused, significant problems. But again, it kind of isn't too much of an issue today. We still see cases pop up incrementally. But then in 2019, this new, kind of pneumonia started popping up in patients in China and quickly exploded into where we are with this national or international global pandemic. So the World Health Organization officially declared this a pandemic in March, on March 13th. And as you know, we are now at a point in the US where we have well over 7 million cumulative cases, well over 200,000 deaths. And, it's been a global crisis of really unprecedented proportion. The biggest thing that we compare it to is the flu pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu. And so it's interesting. And one question I get is, well, the original SARS went away. Won't this one just go away too? What's so different about SARS-CoV-2 compared to the first SARS, for example? And what I can tell you there is this really is, in terms of kind of viruses, a perfect storm. So what makes it so different from that first SARS? The first SARS had a pretty high mortality rate, in the order of 30% of people who got it died. And that's significantly higher than what we're dealing with today, where we say the mortality is 1% to 2%. And people are like, okay, no big deal. 98, 99% of people who get this virus are going to be fine. Well, still 1%, 2% of a global population is a lot of people. 1% to 2% of 330 million people in the US is a lot of people. What makes SARS-CoV-2 so special is it's not as hot. It doesn't kill people as readily. So what viruses depend on, they're not living organisms in and of themselves. They require, they have to live and grow in a person or in a host, but in this case, we are the host. And so by it not being quite as deadly, that allows it to have kind of a steady supply of new people to infect to keep itself going. It's easily transmissible. So that's what we mean when we say it can spread easily. And that's one of the challenges that we've been grappling here with globally, but here in the US is, and we'll get into this later, but, having appropriate testing, being able to trace people, because the other issue is some people get the virus and they never even realize that they're infected. That's what we talk about with being asymptomatic versus the symptomatic piece. We all know about, well, if you have a cough or fever, or you lose your sense of taste or smell, all those are kind of hallmarks of what we understand about the virus so far. So we think, well, if I don't have any of those, I must be okay, right? I'm in the clear, but we could actually be transmitting the virus unbeknownst to us. So SARS-CoV-2 is kind of the perfect storm. And that's where we are today. So I'm going to pause there and just see if there are any questions before we get into some of the other myths. Or
any questions that anyone has?
I'll back up to another comment I made. And, the other thing that people often get stuck on, or, we're just trying to figure out, how does this compare? And the challenge now that we're going into fall and winter is, the similarities to flu. Obviously,
I had for you, Amy. That was what I was thinking too.
Yeah, the symptoms are very similar. And in fact, we already went through a period where there was this overlap because, as you know, this really started unfolding in the US by February and into March, and then kind of exploded from there. But we were within a flu season when this first landed on our shores. And, so people will say, well, this really isn't more severe than, the flu. And I would say that is incorrect. On average, obviously flu seasons vary and some are more severe than others. And thankfully we have a flu vaccine, and I encourage all of you, if you haven't already gotten your flu shot this year, to do so, because that's one of the best protections we have against flu, and to also keep us from having to go to the doctor or go to the ER where we could get exposed to SARS-CoV-2. So that is a key point I want to reinforce. But on average, a flu season will kill maybe 36,000 people. And that, so here we are about, in just the span of less than a year, we've already had as many deaths as kind of 5 flu seasons combined. It is much more severe. I think what is different about SARS-CoV-2 is just how widespread the virus impacts are throughout the body. So what happens when a virus, this is a respiratory virus, so it can enter your body through your nose, through your mouth, even through your eyes. And that's why sometimes you'll see people advise you to wear eye protection or eye cover. To enter a cell in your body, the virus expresses different proteins on its cell. You've probably all seen these cartoon representations of the virus, and it looks like it has these spikes on it, these little things that protrude out from it. And that's kind of what gave it its name, corona, meaning crown. So these spike proteins form this kind of crown, and those are the proteins that you can think of them, they will then dock with a receptor on the host cell. So if this is the spike protein, it's going to approach the cell and it's going to bind a receptor on the cell. And then the cell says, okay, I'm going to now absorb that virus. And when the virus gets into the cell, it has genetic material. So that sounds scary. What am I talking about with genetic material? We all know about our genes and DNA, which is kind of the recipe for all of our, for what makes us us. There's DNA and there's RNA. So coronaviruses, like SARS-CoV-2, have RNA inside them. But once it gets in the cell, it basically has its own recipe for eventually taking over the cell's machinery and making more copies of itself. So it wants to reproduce itself, right? Because this is kind of a parasite, if you will, that's living in you and trying to make more copies of itself so it can go on and infect other people. Well, that receptor on the host cell is expressed in tissues throughout your body. So it's not just in your lungs, it's in your kidneys, it's in your intestines. We've heard about neurological symptoms and impacts from the virus. So that is the scariest part, I think, of this virus, is just how wide ranging its impacts can be. And that's another thing that I want to, caution people about is, it doesn't sound that bad. Only 1 or 2% of people are going to die. Well, what we now understand is even among those who survive, you may have long-term impacts as a result. I have a good friend who is a lung cancer advocate. He's actually not a lung cancer patient, but his father had passed away from lung cancer, and he's just gotten involved in the advocacy world because of that. He's in the North Carolina, Wake Forest area, so we have that thing in common. And he was sick back at the beginning of the year with a very severe bronchitis, and kind of that question was in the back of his mind, like, could that have been SARS-CoV-2? And he went and got tested for antibodies. And we'll get into that and what that means in a little bit. But it turns out he was positive for antibodies, which means he had been infected in the past. And, over the course of the summer, so again, this was first of the year, he told this story of he was driving somewhere to meet his wife. And as he was driving, he suddenly just couldn't remember where he was going. He just pulled off on the side of the road and called his wife and had to, kind of be picked up. And went to the doctor, obviously, and was having some other issues with memory, and thought that maybe he was in early stages of Alzheimer's. So they did a workup. He went to Duke, which is one of the great places to go if you've got that kind of thing going on. And turns out they diagnosed him with a form of dementia associated with COVID, and that he's got some behavioral disorder, and they're hopeful and optimistic that he'll make a full recovery. But the point being that because these receptors, these docking sites for the virus are so widespread in your body, it means it can have lots of different impacts. And we're only really beginning to fully understand the breadth of those impacts. So, I just caution people to keep your guard up, right? Especially, the things that we know are risk factors include, being older, having comorbidity, so having diabetes, having high blood pressure. There's a number of those that we know put people at increased risk. But even age isn't necessarily a defining issue anymore. The young are equally susceptible. So what can we do to protect ourselves? We continue to reinforce the message of wear your mask, wash your hands, watch your distance, try to keep up those things, because right now that's our best defense. We have to break that chain of transmission of the virus. It doesn't care, if you're male or female, if you're young or old, if you're, Republican or Democrat or, any of those things. It just wants a person to grow in. That's all it cares about. It's just a bag of RNA and proteins. It doesn't have the capacity to, choose who it infects. It just goes after anybody. So those are the things we can do to keep safe. So again, the myth versus reality, it is worse than the flu. It can have long-term effects, and I'll stop there.
Yeah. One, I know that, we hear a lot about mask wearing, and, we hear about people who don't want to wear masks and all that kind of stuff. I think early on, like back in March, April or so, we were told that we didn't have to worry about wearing a mask um, unless we were symptomatic.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, and as scientists learned more about the disease and about the virus, that guidance evolved
Mm-hmm.
um, to a point where everybody needs to wear a mask all the time when you're out in public, because of asymptomatic spread.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually that's probably the thing that makes this virus so dangerous, is that
Mm-hmm.
at least if you have the flu, you're going to know that. You're going to know you have the flu and you will stay home. But if you're
Mm-hmm.
asymptomatic, you don't know you're even carrying it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just comment on that, or if that makes any sense.
Well, I think that's a thing that a lot of people have struggled with, is just the pace with which scientific information seems to change, and the pace with which recommendations seem to change. It almost seems like one day they're saying one thing and the next day they're saying the complete opposite, and it's created a lot of skepticism and even distrust of the scientific community, which I think is unfortunate, because before this thing, appeared on the world scene in late 2019, we had never seen this particular virus before. Some people will say, but we've seen SARS and we've seen MERS, so isn't it just the same virus? And no, it's not the same virus. It's related, but its behavior and everything about it is completely new and different. It is a novel virus. And the way science works is, we make our best judgments based on the information we have in hand at the time. But, we have to be willing and able to adjust as we learn more. And, yes, in the early days, that was, the way it was presented. If you weren't obviously symptomatic, you didn't need to wear a mask. But it became clear over time that asymptomatic spread was happening and is obviously a concern. And so the guidance became, again, using public health measures, which again, in the absence of effective therapeutics or vaccines, is really the only tool in our tool belt to keep the virus at bay. We had to adjust. And it's unfortunate that we're at a point in this country where where things have become so politically fraught, because it does present danger to people. And I think that, I've tried through my own job and career and social media presence, try to be visible as a scientist and to make science accessible and understandable, because it's scary, people who aren't, who didn't grow up, with a science background. It's just overwhelming, frankly. I mean, we're all dealing with this in real time, and we're all experiencing different stresses and anxieties, and, people are struggling financially, they're struggling with their mental health, they're struggling with being cut off from loved ones, and to have the complexity of information that is just coming like a fire hose, it's hard for people who are in the know to keep up sometimes, let alone the general public, so yes, I appreciate the frustration that it presents, but we are doing our best to learn as much as we can, as fast as we can. And that's the one thing that I always reinforce to people, just the pace with which we are understanding this, again, novel virus. We went from first even knowing it existed in December to having its entire genetic sequence within a few weeks in January. And now we have at least 10, and we'll get into treatment vaccines, but there are hundreds of vaccine efforts underway. There are 10 that are already in phase 3, which is kind of the highest level of clinical trials. There are 10 that are in phase 3 clinical trials with a number of others behind that in different phases. So we are making rapid progress, and that's a testament to, if this pandemic had happened at any other time in history, we would be at a even worse place. But I think because scientific advances are where we are, we've been able to understand it and work with it and make swift progress. So that's a silver lining. We always have to look for the silver linings in the midst of all the insanity, that we're facing.
Yeah. All right. Well, any questions pertaining to the messaging about COVID, myths that you hear, urban legends that you hear?
I see a hand.
Yeah. Who's
Blue shirt? Yes, Karen.
Maurice. I'm sorry.
Yeah. I'm a scientist, and I really felt that when the politicians use the fact that, science does evolve. And as you said, there was one thing they were saying before, that the asymptomatics didn't have to wear a mask and all like that. And then when they found out, but the politicians have turned that around and used it to polarize the public that science is bad.
Yeah.
And that's what really hurts me, because their president loved and took the medicine that had been developed by science and yet turn around and badmouth the scientists. Isn't that something?
Yep.
It's been a challenge, and I've tried to be very politically neutral throughout this, and in the information that I present online, because I very much view this as a crisis for humanity, and we can't afford for it to be politicized in the way it's been politicized. And I felt a very real responsibility, to friends and family, and I'm connected to so many lung cancer patients online. I feel that I cannot sit on the sidelines. I have to represent the science to the best of my ability, and to be seen as real and accessible, and struggling with some of the same issues that everybody else is struggling with. I'm a mom of young kids. I'm trying to balance, my job and keeping my family safe and keeping them educated. And, it's a lot for a lot of people, and we're all having different anxieties and pressures, but science is science, and truth is truth. But the scientific process is, you have a hypothesis, you test it. Sometimes the data proves that hypothesis, and sometimes it proves it wrong. And you have to be willing to acknowledge that and adapt and adjust course accordingly. And that doesn't mean science is failing. When we acknowledge those mistakes and we acknowledge that what we thought was right initially is wrong, that's science doing what it's supposed to do and evolving in real time. So, I get that it is overwhelming, but, I am deeply still encouraged by the progress we're making. And, I always say that there is hope and I believe that we will come out of this, but we all have to do our part, and that means, I have certain skills and certain understanding that not everybody has, but everybody can take those simple steps, wear a mask and keep your distance and wash your hands. And it's, we all look out for each other when we do that.
The other point you made about the long-term effects of it, many young people who really don't get bad symptoms and everything, I feel in the long run, they are going to come down with these side effects. Mm-hmm. And it is going to be bad for many of them who now think, oh, it was nothing.
Yeah, I mean, there's been no shortage of stories of athletes who, particularly football players. There was a high-profile case, a Georgia State University football player who, was having heart issues. So there's been a number of those examples where, we're still trying to understand the mechanism and how the virus is causing cardiac or heart injury. But there's a growing body of data to say that it is happening. So it's affecting your heart, it's affecting, neurological. You heard the example I gave you, and there are others like that, kidneys. So it's a full-on assault to the body. And part of that is, just our immune system sometimes, and this is where the 1918 flu pandemic and SARS-CoV-2 might be similar, that as your body tries to fight back against the virus, sometimes your immune system just goes haywire and it fights too much and overly aggressive. And some of that inflammation or overactive immune response is really what's damaging people and making them so acutely sick. And we're still trying to understand, why do some people, have such a horrific response, and why some people, get it and are relatively asymptomatic or have mild disease. There are lots of things that we still don't know, but we know way more than we did when this first started. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions on messaging, myths, things you've heard, anything you'd like to get settled? Maybe something you saw on Facebook that you said that can't be right, or I don't know how. Yes, Kathleen.
Yes, I've had several friends who believe they had COVID even before February. Mm-hmm. They feel their bronchitis or their bout of pneumonia or something like that was really COVID, even though they haven't had any tests. How far back do we believe we might have had viruses here? Yep. The virus here.
This is a common thing I see, and a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, I had this really horrific, bout of bronchitis, even Thanksgiving 2019 or back in the fall of 2019, and maybe that was COVID. And I think everybody's kind of hoping, wishing that maybe they had it so that they feel like, I've already been through the storm and I came out on the other side and maybe I have some degree of immunity. There are methods we can use. So there are like these kind of virus people who do this cool kind of genealogy of viruses, and they can take DNA from people that have been infected and they construct these kind of like your family tree. They can construct a tree of the viruses and what mutations are present. And by that, they can trace back to the kind of the initial origin, So there was some data. There's an investigator at Fred Hutch, which is a research institution in Seattle. And as you may recall, Seattle was before New York, we thought Seattle was going to be kind of the epicenter of the outbreak in the US. And the virus kind of hit the coast first. So it hit Seattle, it hit California, it hit New York. But that investigator had done some work to suggest that, January, there was a patient who he traced, and January was what he found. then CDC and others have done some kind of analysis going back to autopsies. And there was a case out here in the Bay Area where a woman, in her 50s suddenly died February, having, had a recent illness. They went back and did tests on her, and turns out she had COVID. Myself, I can tell a personal anecdote. So I traveled for a work conference mid-January, leaving San Francisco, flying into San Diego. January 23rd, I came down with what first felt like, the worst sore throat I'd ever had in my life, and, fever and aches over a weekend, lots of night sweats. Like I was literally like drenched with night sweat. And I thought, maybe this is something, COVID hadn't even crossed my mind. But then I've had flu before, and flu had just literally knocked me out. Like I had in college and was bedridden for a week, couldn't stand up, and I was like, this was just a blip, right? But then I got this cough that would not go away for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I was on a call with some of my lung cancer patients who are stage 4. And I was coughing so hard and so much that I had to turn off my video and turn off my, audio. And literally they're on the other end of the, line saying, oh my gosh, I hope she's okay. And, so when I finally was able to come around, I was like, y'all have stage 4 cancer, but you're fine. I'm the one who's falling apart. And, in retrospect, I wonder, myself, was that COVID? And I even went and got an antibody test in May. My antibody test was negative. Now that we'll get into tests and sensitivity and, the issue of false positives and false negatives, I may never know if I had COVID. What I can tell you is it probably was here. We have some data to suggest it was at least January. There are more studies underway, and they may suggest it was even earlier than that. But, I wouldn't say we can bet the bank that. I'm skeptical that it had yet penetrated, our communities to that extent that early on. I think it probably still was kind of located to the coast, because that's where a lot of flights come into the country from outside. So you had the kind of this wave from China, but a lot of the cases that seeded New York were coming through Europe, and then we had the shutdowns on travel and whatnot. But since the initial wave in the spring, which was the Northeast, then we kind of had the summer wave that the Southeast was exploding with COVID. Georgia was getting really, really bad, as was other, deep pockets. And that was very concerning to many of us because, it was questions of, people being rural and not having good care and, access to ventilators and all the things that we knew would be needed. And then that kind of subsided. And now what we see is the Midwest was getting hit pretty hard. So like currently Wisconsin is a hot spot in states along that Midwest corridor. And now, unfortunately, as predicted, now that we're entering fall and getting into cooler weather, which is forcing people more indoors, we're starting to see that expected fall surge that everybody's been saying could occur. And that's, a very real concern for all of us right now, is how do we, keep that under control? And is it going to, explode in the way we think it could, or is it just going to kind of hit some kind of plateau? Time will tell. We don't fully know, but, the things that you have to think about, we're coming into the holidays and, there are steps you need to at least consider, as you look to your planned activities. Halloween's around the corner. I have young kids. Thanksgiving is a time when we normally come together with families. And, what we've been telling at least the lung cancer community, there's several good resources, and I can maybe send Tom some of these links, but come up with a plan for how you expect to navigate the holidays, and, make sure that all the people that are in your circle kind of agree to a common set of practices, that you're all adhering to wearing the mask and practicing social distancing. And even, think about the COVID burden where you are, think about the COVID burden where people that may be coming to you, think about what that is and consider, getting tested ahead of time. There's a whole number of things, because we're having to achieve that balance, right? Initially, this exploded onto the scene, and we all hoped that it would somehow magically go away, and then it didn't. And 1 month turned into 2, turned into, now we're 6, 7, 8 months in, and it's not going away. So this is our new normal, and we have to figure out how to live in the new normal because of the other things that we've talked about, the mental health burden, and people can't be isolated or shut off from the world forever. So we have to figure out, how do we balance safety with practicality and mental health, and getting back to work or school or all the things that we need to do, but doing it as safely as possible.
Yeah. You mentioned testing a few times in the last minute or so. Why don't we use that then as a segue into just the broad area of testing?
Mhm.
Questions like, what types of testing are available? Why is testing so important? Things like that.
Yeah, so there's different testing, and there's tests where you want to figure out, one, am I actively infected, or maybe you've recently been around somebody who's infected and you need to find out for yourself. And so that's the classic test, where you go in for the nasal swab. And so you've seen the pictures, it looks like a long Q-tip that, people get stuck up their nose, and some people say it feels like their brains, being dug out or whatever, but I don't think it's that dramatic, Anyway, my brother's had several tests for his work, and he's like, it's not that bad. But that's the test. And so what they're trying to do is it's what's called reverse RT-PCR. So that's almost 11 initials. What they're looking for is the genetic material of the virus itself. And again, since it's the respiratory virus that infects your nasal, cavity and in your respiratory system, they're wanting to get to where it may be kind of hiding out. But they're looking for the genetic material. And so when they do this PCR-based test, what they're trying to do is make more copies of whatever genetic material is there. And so the way that assay works is, if it takes them a long time to pick up a signal, that means that test is negative. But if they see that signal pretty much, pretty soon, that means there is, genetic material there, and it's considered a positive. There have been issues, but I mean, that's kind of the gold standard of, when you want to find out, do I have an active infection? There's also something, and, the challenge there has been, turnaround time, right? Because sometimes, well, first it was just availability. We have struggled as a nation to have enough tests to test people. Because obviously, to effectively trace, maybe Tom was having a wild party and, was around a lot of people, and and we need to know, like, who was in that circle and who may be at risk. We don't have a good way of doing that right now. Some places are better than others, but it got so out of hand so fast that we haven't been able to really do effective contact tracing, which has been a hallmark of what CDC once did. When these kinds of things have, unfolded in the past, CDC would kind of come in on the scene, that they could trace and figure out that it was, a water fountain in whatever building. And that was the source of the, outbreak.
Amy, let me just interject real quick. I assume that's something, the contact tracing is something that other countries that have seen much greater success in their COVID response, that's what they've been doing.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at like South Korea and a lot of the countries in Asia, Vietnam, even, I mean, you hate to say it, like third world countries like Rwanda, have these robots that they're using to like do all this stuff. And, there are challenges, like the countries are smaller. Maybe they don't, in some cases, and some of the European ones, the argument has been, well, they're not as big or not as populous. But they have been able to effectively do that. And that's, normally would be an important piece of controlling this, but that's not where we are. So back to the testing. So that was one, availability. Then two was turnaround time. It doesn't do you a whole lot of good to go in and get a swab and not find out your results for 7 days or 2 weeks or whatever it is, because by that time you've already infected, however many other people. because this virus, we talk about what's called something called the reproduction number, the R sub 0, the R naught. And for flu, it's a little over one person. So I get sick, I'm going to make Tom sick, but I'm not going to make the rest of you sick. If I have SARS-CoV-2, I'm going to make Tom and the gentleman below me on the screen sick. 2 or 3 people. That's the reproduction number. Then we have, just for kind of perspective, like measles, the reproduction number is like 18. So if I have measles, it's horrible. Thankfully, backing up to myths versus realities and comparisons, if, when we talk about airborne versus not airborne, those kinds of things, measles is kind of like the classic airborne virus. It lingers in the air for a long time and can make a lot of people sick. If that was the situation we were in right now, we would be in a world of hurt in a much darker, horrific place globally. So thankfully we're not there, but just on the point of airborne, there is the concern that the virus can linger in the air for the matter of a few hours. So when we talk about indoor activities like bars or indoor restaurants, even that don't have good ventilation, that is a risk that there can be transmission. So on the testing front, availability, turnaround time. Another way so because of that, then people tried to develop faster tests. And so we've heard about like a rapid antigen test, and that's where you're trying to look for, different proteins expressed by the virus. And, there are efforts underway to develop, kind of these rapid 5-15 minute cheaper tests that, you can just take and immediately kind of get an answer, yes or no. That was where early on, some of the rapid antigen tests were giving high rates of false positives or false negatives. Just the reliability has been an issue. So, availability, turnaround time, reliability, those have been all things that have plagued the testing, landscape throughout this pandemic. And, it's kind of a surprise to me, just as a scientist, that here in the US, that we've struggled as much as we have with the whole testing and being able to scale up and develop accurate tests. And in CDC, that's another place where there's been a lot of frustration because CDC has been inconsistent in messaging, and the test that they had initially developed wasn't, they didn't adopt the one that the World Health Organization had, and their test was flawed, and it just complicated things as well. So, I think science has to own its mistakes and missteps. So that's if you want to find out if you have an active infection. Now the question is, how do I find out if I was infected at some point in the past? That's where we're looking to your blood for the presence of antibodies. So antibodies are these molecules that your immune cells make that can bind to the virus and kind of take it out of commission, if you will. It's more complicated than that, but it serves our purpose here. So those antibodies will, be in your blood and will circulate for some period of time. And so you can go and have some blood drawn and see if you have antibodies to the virus, which would suggest that at some point in the past you have been infected. The question then became, well, what does that mean if I have antibodies to the virus? Does that mean I have my get out of jail free card and I'm free and clear and everything's good? That's also complicated for SARS-CoV-2 because we don't know how long immunity lasts or if it even lasts. Our best data to date suggests, and what we know about other coronaviruses is that immunity may last from a few months to maybe a couple of years. This isn't going to be one of those viruses where you get it and you're protected for life. So, but again, that response varies in people. I've heard, I have several friends who work at the CDC, and so they were testing the son of one of their employees for antibodies because he'd had a confirmed PCR positive case. So they had detected, the genetic material and knew that he was sick. So after the fact, they wanted to test him for antibodies. He didn't have any. So in some cases, when you have a mild case, you may not generate an antibody response, or there's been questions about durability. How long do those antibodies last? And are they kind of declining over time? Again, I am linked in with some investigators at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York on a project studying antibody responses in lung cancer patients, but this guy's, got a name for doing these kinds of tests. And it looks like antibodies are lasting longer than what we were initially fearing. So they are hanging out. But again, even if you get tested for antibodies, you're found to have them, don't take that as some kind of free hall pass and you're good to go. We also know there's increasing reports of reinfection. So there have been people who've been infected once and they can seemingly get infected again. So there's still a lot we don't understand, but that's the difference. So if you want to find out if you have an active infection, you're either going to get the nasal swab or get a rapid antigen test. If you want to find out if you have antibodies, you're going to do that through blood. There are some saliva tests under development. So they're trying to come up with, simpler, easier ways, maybe so you could collect a sample at home versus having to go in and, having it done by another person to minimize, again, that interaction with other people, which introduces, an element of risk. I mean, it's pretty low risk, but still an element of risk. So lots of efforts underway to improve testing, to scale up testing, to improve turnaround times and all those things.
Amy,
Yes.
one of the words that you I'm really concerned, not that you're using it, but because it's so common in our conversations these days, is return to normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
And my concern about that is there's a lot in that implies in normalcy we tend to forget what's happening to us. And I point back to that 1918 epidemic. It wasn't just in this country. That was huge in Europe. It was a factor in the First World War. I mean,
estimates are 50 to 100 million people globally died.
That's right.
Yes.
And I never read about that in my history books until after I was out of graduate school and happened to pick a wonderful book that was well written about that. And I said, where's this information about this vulnerability of people individually and in groups to this kind of unexpected but very real danger and greatness and the size of a plague? And I'm taking a course right now in a class here that's about the history of epidemics in art. And everybody's surprised, and then they forget it, and the next generation is surprised.
Right.
I guess what I want to say is, how can we build some memory, cultural memory or scientific memory, that percolates down through the ages after us? Because these waves are not strangers to the human existence.
Right.
Our memories become strangers, and we think that, well, we're back to normal, we don't have to worry about that anymore. And that's, to me, that's just
it'll be interesting to see how this transforms us, as a human race. I don't know if people just kind of let their guard. I mean, I'm a trained virologist, so is my husband, and even this, I never actually, even though I knew it could happen, I never fully expected to live through it myself.
Exactly.
And that sounds insane, but it caught me by surprise, and it shouldn't have. And I guess I thought that maybe, science was powerful enough that we could get this under control, or that people would do the right thing, that they would feel compelled as, to look out for their fellow man. And 1918 was drastically different than 2020. And part of the lethality then, what's unique, and there's a great book, and I don't know if this is the one you read, that's called The Great Influenza, which is a very accessible historical overview of the 1918 pandemic. It hit young people hard. And this is another point that I always kind of reinforce from that book. We hear talk about the China virus, and I always say pandemics, viruses can erupt around the world. We saw obviously Ebola in West Africa, the 1918 pandemic. Most history points to it started in military barracks in Kansas, and it was transported to the trenches of World War I in the European theater, and that's where it really exploded. But it was unique in that typically flu will go after the very young and the very old, but this was hitting people in their prime, in their 20s, and it was the cytokine storm. It was that unleashed extreme immune response that was killing people. And that's what the parallel is here. And, even though the early deaths were more in the elderly, and that's still the most probably susceptible population for SARS-CoV-2, there have been, there's some reports, CDC did a study that showed like a 26% increase in excess deaths between ages, 20s to 40s, over the last several years. And it's because of SARS-CoV-2, so I don't know what it will take, but on the topic of memory, there's something called immunological memory. And, so we've all been thinking about antibodies. Everybody thinks that's the holy grail. And, as long as I'm making antibodies or I can get antibodies like the president did, then I'm okay. There's two types of cells that make up your immune system. There's T cells and there's B cells. B cells are the ones that typically make the antibodies. T cells have the ability to, there's some called cytotoxic T cells. So it's kind of like they can go in and do things to the virus and kind of blow cells up, and kill them. So, they're like these little secret agents of your immune system. But your immune system has memory. So, it sees a virus, and like even with the 1918 flu, scientists have been able to go back to survivors and, take their B cells, and they still recognize that virus. It was so potent that they remember it. And so they've taken antibodies from those survivors or from samples from those patients. And then they can manufacture those antibodies in the lab. They can engineer them in the lab to have the similar kind of structure and function of those antibodies. So your immune system remembers, and hopefully that will be a blessing in disguise of this pandemic, and maybe it will help us. But the reality is, the challenge is that this was one virus that was circulating, in bats in China, and then, went into another species of pangolin and did some weird mixing around, and then suddenly was able to infect humans. As humans continue to expand and encroach on the natural world, we're getting closer and closer to, things that put us at risk like this. So there is a grant that's funded to kind of do a routine surveillance of what are the viruses that are circulating in these animal populations, and is there another one that has pandemic potential? With flu, it typically circulates in waterfowl, so like chickens and ducks, and then it can also infect pigs. And the thing about flu is it's also has RNA as its genetic material, but it has different pieces of RNA in its, in the flu particle. And so those pieces can shuffle, as it goes between things. And that's why our flu season, every year we have to make a new vaccine, because we have different combinations. And we talk about the H and the N. So there's different numbers, like the 2009 H1N1 pandemic that actually started in Mexico, when we're talking about places where virus pandemics start. But we've heard about bird flu H5N1. So there's different H's and N's, and that's just because of what we call this reassortant, and this kind of continuous shuffling of the virus between birds and pigs and humans. And so all that is to say that this could very well happen again. Yeah. And hopefully the lessons we learn from this, we won't forget. But humans being human, hopefully we will learn our lesson, and we will come up with appropriate pandemic responses and have a plan. And I don't want to be political, but I feel like we definitely need a plan. We're operating in the absence of a plan right now. And so that's where we are.
Amy,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be political, but we did have a plan 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And so rather than muddle through that, what do the scientists, what do those of you doing research in this area, what are you thinking would be the best plan for the governments to be in charge of this, for, what?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets above my pay grade probably, but I don't
Okay.
to alienate too many people, but I do think there needs to be a more coordinated national plan and, national, even if we had said, and I think back to the Great Depression and FDR and how he mobilized the Civilian Conservation Corps, to
Right,
provide
right.
jobs to people that were out of jobs, to build national parks. Why not? If people are out of jobs, how can we mobilize our country to respond to this unprecedented crisis? And I think it does take, leadership at all levels, from the top down, to local, to state, to national, working in a coordinated manner. But that's not really my area of expertise, but I do feel like we could do better in the future.
Yeah. Amy, let's shift gears just a little bit, and let's talk about treatment.
Mm-hmm.
If you're unfortunate enough to come down with COVID and you have to be hospitalized, what are the doctors going to offer you?
So I think it varies according, to the spectrum of your disease. So, you're talking about hospitalized, but, let's back up and recognize there's going to be asymptomatic people that probably have mild disease and recover at home, and it's no big deal. And do they need some kind of treatment up front? The president, obviously being the most recent high profile example, came down with the virus and very quickly was put on a combination of the therapies that we have in our arsenal right now. You may have seen, or if you haven't seen today, the FDA granted approval to remdesivir, and that is one of the drugs the president received. It's an antiviral drug. So the best comparison I have for that is Tamiflu. If you've had flu, you've heard about Tamiflu. That's the same kind of bucket of treatment. So it's designed to decrease the viral load. It was developed a number of years ago, actually tested against a number of viruses, was found to have activity against Ebola and Marburg, which is kind of a sister to Ebola. It was originally developed for hepatitis C, but kind of was a dud when it came to hepatitis C, and then they realized it had activity. And so they already had some safety data from using it in Ebola, or testing it in that context. And so when this pandemic emerged, they pulled it off the shelf and tested it against SARS-CoV-2 and found it had some activity. There's been some debate again about, there was a study that showed that it decreases the length of hospitalization and mortality for some patients. The World Health Organization put out what's called a preprint, was it last week, recently, that did this big global study, and they were saying that remdesivir showed no benefit. But as I've read it and understand it, there's several concerns and potential flaws in how that study was set up. So there's still some debate, but the FDA did grant it approval today. So I think that if you're hospitalized and have a more severe case, you're likely to get remdesivir. But I question the efficacy of using it at later stages in more severe disease. Usually for those types of treatments, there's a window. Like with Tamiflu, they typically tell you to get it within the first 48 hours of having flu symptoms. It's not going to really help you if you're a week into your bout with the flu. So I do think we may hopefully see some moving of that treatment into the earlier stage of disease. But again, we have to ramp up supply of the drug and some of those things. So remdesivir is one that you've probably heard about. There was a lot of debate about good old hydroxychloroquine early on, and that one got highly politicized. There's been study after study after study that's basically shown that hydroxychloroquine does not work. So you're not going to get that. You should not get that. The other one that the president received was an antibody cocktail made by a company called Regeneron. So again, this is the concept that, your immune system normally will produce antibodies, but that typically takes some time to come around. Like they will tell you, if you were sick and you want to find out, well, do I have antibodies? They're going to advise you to wait several weeks because it takes your body time to produce those antibodies in sufficient levels to be detected. So we're able to kind of manufacture in the lab antibodies that can combat the virus. And he received this cocktail of antibodies. So that's another one that's out there. But again, it's a manufacturing issue right now. So we have a limited number of doses. I think the company said it had maybe 50,000 doses. They're hoping to ramp that up to maybe 300,000 in the next 3 months or next 6 months. How then are you going to triage who gets it, at what time? Obviously the president, being the president, he gets, access to whatever we have and should, the president of the of one of the greatest countries on earth should get access to drugs, but that creates issues for access for the general public. So how do we ramp that up? How do we ensure equitable distribution and make sure that it's available? And then there's cost issues. So it's complicated, but that's where we are right now. So a combination of antivirals and these antibody treatments. And there are others. Eli Lilly is a company that's developing an antibody cocktail or therapeutic that would be comparable to Regeneron. So there are multiple companies kind of pursuing these antivirals, pursuing antibodies. There were some others that were tested, like they tried to repurpose some drugs that were used in HIV, and that data was not so good. With the hyperactivated immune response, there have been some efforts to test different inhibitors of certain of those immune modulators, if you will, and those are giving mixed results. So I think the ones that are currently, showing the most promise are remdesivir and this Regeneron cocktail. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we get into vaccines. So do you want me to pause there, or do you want
let's pause. Let's pause here, and just if there are any questions that anyone has about treatment.
I failed to mention dexamethasone, which is a steroid that has been around for some time, and that has also been shown, and that was another thing that the president received. Yeah. And repurposed again here, a known drug, and is showing some efficacy. So that's good that we have some things in the arsenal that have been beneficial in treating other diseases that we were able to rapidly pull off the shelf and test against, this novel virus while we wait for vaccines and other things to be developed. So that's another one that, I had a friend from Pickens who, just had a pretty serious bout. It wasn't in the hospital, but, her doctor was trying a course of steroids, and she wasn't on dexamethasone initially, but was eventually put on dexamethasone. But she had some kidney complications, and, so she had a pretty nasty run with the virus. Thankfully is now seemingly on the other side, whatever the other side looks like. She feels better, but we still, again, don't fully know, because we're just, less than a year into this, what long-term means and looks like for people who recover. And there are those that are truly considered long haulers that don't seem to clear the virus at all. They keep testing positive repeatedly over months and months, and still have never fully regained their energy, or feel cloudy mentally and are still struggling. So again, I think that's going to be a complicated thing to unravel, and it's probably going to be a mix of the nature of the immune response and kind of the genetics of the person, and it's going to be probably the virus load and how much virus they were exposed to. It's not going to be an easy answer. But
I assume that the ingestion of bleach is not recommended, right?
I wouldn't recommend it.
All right.
One thing I just wanted to mention, if I could, Tom.
Yeah, Maurice. Uh-huh.
Maybe Amy can mention about the number of people who need to be vaccinated, so that you have your
herd immunity.
Because that is going to be another big problem.
Yep. So, the current debate is what is our best path to quote unquote herd immunity? And that's this protective ring that we achieve when enough people have either been infected through natural infection, so just coming down with the virus, or through vaccination. And, what we know about herd immunity is that threshold is around 70% of the population needs to be immune to protect those. And, there are people among us, whether it be flu or something else, who may not be eligible to be vaccinated. So they have other things that prohibit them from being vaccinated. And that will likely still be the case for SARS-CoV-2. Now, there are those who say we should just pull the Band-Aid off and just let this virus do what it's going to do, run unchecked through the population, and let's just get there as fast as possible, and we'll get herd immunity by just letting the virus do its thing. Again, 1 to 2% of 330 million people is a lot of deaths. And we're, are we willing to absorb that blow?
Yeah.
And I would argue that human life is important, and that is not the path that we should take. The other path to achieving herd immunity is through vaccination. And, we are on the path to having one or more vaccines within the next year. Obviously there have been different promises made about the timeline, but realistically, we're not going to have the readout from many of these vaccine trials maybe until first quarter of 2021. Moderna, which is one of the leading front runners, is hoping that they may be able to have some data this fall and go for, like some kind of approval. End of year, early next year into the summer is what we're realistically looking at for a vaccine. But obviously people are skeptical. Before SARS-CoV-2 ever happened, there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy in our country, and that's related to childhood vaccinations and reported links to autism, and that is a harm that's been inflicted upon society through bad science and a person who had bad motivations. And so we're still trying to dig out from that. But yeah, I mean, the point is well taken that if people are unwilling to get vaccinated, we're going to have very real challenges. And the other thing I want to, make clear is that we don't expect this virus to go away once we have the vaccine. The flu doesn't go away and we have a vaccine for it. We expect that this will become part of our seasonal landscape of viruses. So, it's probably going to be flu, it's going to be RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, that babies and toddlers and elderly get. It's going to be SARS-CoV-2. And so what that probably means, I would hope or expect that once we have a vaccine that we may have some protection for 2, 3, several years. So you probably will have to get vaccinated, every so often. With the current front runners, AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, with their particular vaccine, well, with AstraZeneca, Moderna, the RNA vaccines that are out there. So there's Moderna and Pfizer are developing these RNA-based vaccines. So they're trying to take some of the genetic material from the virus, shoot it into you, and that's the instructions to then, trigger an immune response. That requires at least 2 shots. So not only are you asking people to get vaccinated, you're asking them to come in for not 1, but 2 shots. So making that happen is going to take some magic, or some very compelling arguments. With AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, they're using actually the virus that I worked on from a PhD, a virus called adenovirus, and using it as a vector to trigger, this immune response. It'll be single dose, but AstraZeneca's study was recently put on hold after a participant in the clinical trial had this weird adverse event, and Johnson & Johnson similarly, we don't know what the adverse event was there. I would say that when you have studies involving tens of thousands of people, you're going to have these events happen. It doesn't mean that that vaccine has failed or that this trial is going to fail, but we have to have those built-in precautions to ensure patient safety. So that's how trials work. So I'm kind of all over the place on that comment, but I think herd immunity, yes, it's going to be, obviously we're having some natural infection going on, but we need to couple that with a robust vaccination program. And I think that's only when we will achieve 60 to 70%. And the CDC is actually doing some surveillance projects in cities across the country to say, what is the current seropositivity rate? How many people currently have antibodies to the virus? New York is probably the farthest ahead at 20% best case scenario. So we are far from that 70% threshold. Other places around the country, we're still single digits. And in other places, they've done studies, investigators have in like the Amazon and in Spain, it's still 5, 6, 7%. So globally, we are still very short of the 70% threshold. And I personally do not believe that just letting the virus run unchecked is the answer that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Amy, what would be your expectation for the rollout of a vaccine? If a vaccine, let's just hypothetically say that the AstraZeneca vaccine gets approved, finally gets final approval, gets green lighted in, say, February of next year, what would be a reasonable expectation for when that vaccine would be available to the general public, to the general American public?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is going to be a tricky situation, and there's groups that have convened to lay out the roadmap for what this will look like, the National Academy of Sciences and others, because we're not going to have enough doses right out of the gate for everybody, the general public, to get vaccinated. So who is at the front of the line? Obviously I would say healthcare workers, will probably be prioritized, and rightfully so. We have to protect those who are taking care of us and keeping us well and treating us when we get sick. High risk populations, the elderly, I work in cancer, so cancer patients may be, prioritized. So there's also some discussion that states may have a role in how the vaccine gets rolled out to patients or to citizens in each state. That's all being worked through now, and a lot of the smart people, are trying to plan for that. But I think we need to just be honest that it's not going to be the vaccine is ready February and you all go to CVS and get in line and get your shot. Right. We're not going to be there yet. So we have to be smart about, trying to roll it out to the people who need it the most first. And as we ramp up manufacturing, then, eventually, I mean, maybe, what's the role of school kids? Getting our economy and life going again, with school shutdowns. Even though children may not get very sick, they could still be involved in transmitting the virus. So is that another way? And one of the vaccine manufacturers is actually expanding its trial to include children down to age 12, so 12 and up, to look at that. But yeah, I think time will tell, but I just also want to be realistic that, we're not going to just all go get our shot right away come February.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, Kathleen.
Hi, Amy. Who will not be able to receive the vaccine because of health issues? For example, I have a friend who says she cannot get the flu vaccine because she's allergic to eggs. Is that right?
Right.
I'm thinking, okay, so why would somebody not? What are you expecting will be the group that won't just out of the gate will not be able to get a vaccine?
I don't know that we fully know that yet. And the good thing here is we have multiple vaccine efforts underway and multiple different platforms, different approaches to making the vaccine. So I talked about Moderna and Pfizer doing this RNA-based vaccine. And then there are some that are taking other viruses and trying to use those as kind of a Trojan horse, if you will, to trigger an immune response. Historically, when we think of vaccines, we may think of like smallpox and Edward Jenner in 1796, who was taking like cowpox and from his milkmaids and using that to immunize people. You typically think of trying to weaken the virus or kill it and injecting the virus that way to trigger the immune response. There's not as much of that. I mean, there are efforts to use what's called live attenuated viruses or killed virus. And so, the good thing there is by having all these different approaches, then maybe that allows us to say, well, you're not eligible for this particular type, but you are a candidate for this type. And so by having multiple different ones, maybe we get better coverage of as many populations as possible. Another question that I've gotten doing this before is, well, if there are multiple vaccines out there, how do I pick? Which one do I choose? And what I would say there, in having this conversation with, some of the leaders in the field, is time may sort that out for us. That if we see, these different vaccines that are out there and one only requires one shot and has, 50, 60, 70% efficacy, and this one over here requires 2 shots and it's 30 or 40%, you're probably going to pick this one, and competition will kind of sort that out. Or so initially there probably won't be a choice, because whatever we have initially, is going to go to certain people, and those are going to get prioritized. And then as we get to the point that is a general public thing, we'll probably see that, our clinical trials or our studies have shown us that one is better than the other. The verdict is still out, but I'm hopeful that because there's so many efforts underway, that we'll be able to have different modalities that allow us to capture as many people as possible.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions on vaccines, vaccine development, vaccine rollout, or anything like that? All right, Amy. Moment we've all been waiting for.
Wait, let me see. I may have a crystal ball. Oh, no, I have one back there. Okay.
When is this thing going to be over?
Yeah.
How much longer do we have to do this?
Yeah. I mean, when we're at the 6th month point, I kind of, to my husband, said, we're halfway to the halfway point. Is the way I think about it personally. Before we're really back to a point of thinking about pre-pandemic life. I would expect that that's still probably reasonable. That, by the time we get a vaccine, we're going to be into the spring or summer, and then it's not going to go away immediately. So I think, even once we have that, we would be well served to continue some of these, same precautions we're taking now. I don't think we're going to get a shot and throw our mask away overnight, and as I said, I think this will probably become part of our seasonal landscape. So, I'm personally prepared for it being a couple of years before I think we are back to where we once were. But, I that sounds scary and, hard to even comprehend, but here we are in almost November, and we're making it through day by day. And so we have to figure out how to define our normal, in a way that keeps us, connected and takes care of our mental health, and that keeps us safe, and do those things. And, I mean, life looks different, but I wouldn't say it's horrible, and I think about prisoners of war, or, I told my daughter at one point, who's in 6th grade, the story of Anne Frank and, hiding from the Nazis in an attic for, however many 100 days or, much longer. And, we're still able to go out and do things and live life. And so we just have to steel ourselves and be prepared for the reality. I think it's better to be prepared and maybe, I don't know, expect the worst and be pleasantly surprised than to keep thinking the end is, just around the corner, or is going to somehow magically be delivered by November 3rd, and be disappointed. So
Yeah, right.
I'm trying to be practical, pragmatic, realistic, honest. So
Yeah, yeah.
maybe by late next year, we're starting to get more widespread rollout of a vaccine. And a lot of these restrictions can ease, but I think we are entering a new period. I think we need to be cautious going through the fall and winter, seeing the surges that we're seeing already, and knowing the potential for how that could play out, and just being as careful as possible. We haven't come this far to to go backward. My concern is, throughout the spring, we made those hard decisions, and we had good adherence to social distancing and mask wearing, and we had lockdowns. And I get it. People look at me and say, well, it's easy for you to say these things. You're able to work from home and this, that, and the other. My father worked in a cotton mill and did drywall at night to support our family. So I know what it's like to be in financially hard times. And I appreciate all the challenges and realities of what's faced by, the people that are keeping our economy afloat. So I know people are reluctant for more lockdowns, but it may come to that, or we, kind of these micro clusters of lockdowns, just to control, kind of localized outbreaks. So maybe it won't be widespread and sweeping the way it was, but I think that helped keep the numbers down somewhat. And if people are now unwilling to do those things throughout the fall, it could be much worse than it was in the spring.
Right.
And that's my biggest fear right now. And so that's why I keep reinforcing the message of do what you can and have a plan, and make hard decisions. I'm not going home to Georgia or South Carolina for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it's hard for me to hear my daughter say, I want to see Grammy and Papa. And I say, I know, I do too, but it's our job to protect them. And she says, yeah, I know.
Yeah, yeah. I remember sitting with my best friend back in March. In fact, it was March 13th, sitting over coffee in Lawrenceville, and I mean, I was literally hours away from calling the members of my session to recommend canceling service for the Sunday, the 15th. And we were sitting at coffee and just talking about, well, how long we thought this was going to last. And we optimistically wanted to believe, yeah, it'll probably be 2 or 3 Sundays away, and then we'll all be back. We'll all be going back to normal, and life will go on. And then, of course, my friend, who is he's a relentless realist, said, well, Tom, I've read some things that actually forecast something much, much bigger and much, much longer and life-changing. And I said, I hope to God you're not right. And I said, but you probably are. And I mean, but neither one of us could have imagined, sitting here at the end of October, and having this conversation. It's just, it would have been unimaginable back in March.
Right.
And now we look forward to, the very real prospect that, you or I are not going to be going to any Atlanta United soccer matches,
My son's a big soccer enthusiast, so he's
yeah. That's the context for that. And in fact, the last time I saw Amy was at a Atlanta United soccer match right before they moved to California. And but just the prospect of that, is really just boggling the mind. And of course, that's precipitated, a real mental health crisis for for so many people. You know, some people, you know, have been able to just kind of roll with it, but so many others just feel, I mean, are lonelier than ever, you know, more isolated than ever.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking. And you know, speaking from a minister's point of view, and I know Kathleen has her, you know, has her perspective on this too. We have had, you know, not only to look out for the spiritual and psychological needs of our congregations, but we've had to take care of ourselves too.
Right.
You know? And so, you know, that's been a unique challenge, you know, on the ministry side. But
Yeah, you know, it's my work, as you mentioned at the beginning, which seems like a long time ago now. I work for a lung cancer foundation, so I oversee the research portfolio. And, you know, this pandemic presents a unique convergence, an unfortunate convergence for our community, with it being a respiratory virus. Lung cancer patients are at elevated risk and have worse outcomes and heightened mortality. About 35% of lung cancer patients who get COVID will, you know, have died based on the data. And so, you know, I've come together with my colleagues at my sister organizations to push out, you know, regular updates to the lung cancer community. But, and I've been very visible on social media, just trying to navigate people through this and sharing as much knowledge as I can, and as an accessible way as I can to make it understandable, because lives are on the line. And, you know, I don't feel, you know, that I could live with myself if I just, you know, checked out and rode this out, you know, in the comfort of my home, and just, you know, kept my knowledge to myself. But that means that it's been very hard. You know, I have shed many tears, you know, just struggling with the place of science, the challenges to science, the connections to patients, you know, challenges to my faith, to my integrity, you know, by making yourself that accessible, you also open yourself up for, you know, hurt. And, you know, it would be easier to just walk away and just say, I'm going to take care of myself. But that's not what I'm called to do.
You are fighting the good fight. You are fighting the good fight, and being, you know, being friends with you, being Facebook friends with you. You know, I told Amy this before, that I have kind of been kind of walking along with her in these experiences that she's had, for, you know, fighting for science and you know, speaking up for the truth, and sometimes getting attacked for it. And you know, it's tough, but Amy is a bold warrior, and she is doing what she needs to do. She's doing exactly what God is calling her to do. No question.
Tom,
Yeah, Kathleen.
there's been a lot of talk recently, and things that I've been listening to and reading about how weary our medical personnel and our researchers and our scientists and our nurses and our aides and our respiratory therapists, how weary they are, and their real need for support in the midst of ugliness of people just really thumbing their nose at the pandemic, not directly at that. Besides just lifting you up in our Thursday afternoon prayer group that we did today, what things would you like to see the faith community do to be supportive? You know, I know how to support a patient. And because I've been a chaplain off and on for years, I know some about supporting staff, but they will not let me in now. I was supposed to be on call that week of March 15th. And of course, that did not happen. I was supposed to be on call at St. Mary's as a volunteer, St. Mary's Hospital. But what would you like to see the faith community doing to support you?
That's a great question, Kathleen. Love that.
Yeah, it's I have a great church home here.
Good.
Attend a Presbyterian church here as well. And so, I feel like I have a support network. And my pastor and church members check in with me pretty regularly and are connected. So, um, I wish I knew the answer, because there's such a
Mhm.
divide, I think, right now. And,
Mhm. Exactly.
how do we, I don't see religion and science being on opposite teams. I see them very much being hand in hand, but not everybody sees it that way. So how do we build more bridges between the two? Because I think, the reality right now, unfortunately, is they do, in many cases, see themselves on opposite sides. And, I would hope that we can extend the olive branch a little bit more. I mean, obviously, I believe in the power of prayer, and feel that God put me where he put me, right place, right time kind of thing. So yeah, I don't have an easy answer, but I know that prayer is powerful. I believe in it. As a scientist, I often will quote that, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. I believe that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's good, Amy. All right, Jude. Yes.
I have a question about what just happened, about the conversation that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
So, am I to understand that there are people in churches who are against science, that are against it? I'm sorry.
I know.
I'm a
I know.
Unitarian Universalist, and so that isn't coming from my congregation, as far as I
Right.
know.
Right. Right.
Right.
It wouldn't come from your congregation.
No,
Right.
no.
Right.
I can give you an example. So I'm connected to many patients and people on social media, and I grew up in Pickens, South Carolina, upstate near Greenville, South Carolina. I grew up Southern Baptist, and went to school, or went to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday, Bible school, all the things, GAs and mission trips, the whole thing. And a patient who was in low country of South Carolina, was just kind of impossible to believe that I grew up Southern Baptist based on everything that I present. She just feels that I had abandoned my religious upbringing, Christianity.
Yeah.
And obviously it's not a universal truth. Obviously there are many Christians who believe in science, but there are many who don't. And so that's where I have seen challenges, and that there is this struggle. And unfortunately, that is also part of the political environment we find ourselves in, and how the election is currently playing out, and that Christian values may be assigned or ascribed to one party over the other, and not seen as being, part of both. And so, yeah, it's a struggle that we all find ourselves in, trying to navigate these times in the next couple of weeks, and just trying to hold our country together in a way that we can come through this better and stronger.
So good. Yeah.
What I hear is people who are saying is, I have faith in God. I don't have faith in a face mask. I'm just giving you an example, and that really, you hear that too. And I want to say I don't hear a lot of it out of Watkinsville First Methodist, but I have had several Facebook friends from previous churches. Some of the, I don't want to stereotype, so I'm not. We're just from other churches that I have served that have used this faith issue. And then there's a handful of folks who say, well, that is my personal choice to do this, versus others like myself who believe it is our responsibility as a citizen to do this, to protect one another. But that's where that comes from. But I do want to emphasize again that I know the faith community can do a lot to support the COVID-19 personnel. We need to speak up. We need to be positive. And maybe we need to, people who are absolutely certain that they don't need to wear a mask. Nothing I say, nothing you say will change their minds.
Unfortunately, I think it won't be real for many people until it impacts them directly.
Exactly.
It's abstract. They hear about it and it's something that's happened to somebody else somewhere else. And there's a sense of false security because it still seems far away. But it's, it moves ever closer. So yeah, and I saw it coming, and that's, the reality of knowing what we know and being trained, how we've been trained, my husband and myself. And, so I was telling friends and family back in January, February, this is coming. You need to get ready. You need to prepare. My kids were on a winter break mid-February, and we took a family trip to Nashville to meet up with some friends from Atlanta. And I pulled my friend, the mom, aside, and I said, you need to plan. You need to stock up. You need to get ready. And thankfully my parents listened. We've seen varying response among my in-laws, and but my dad jokes, he's like, we've been preparing for this pandemic for years, because we don't really go out and do anything. So it wasn't a big adjustment for them, like they're not these people who go out and travel and are used to lots of activities. So they were. And my dad, he's one of the ones that's kind of keeps the humor going. But he told me at the beginning, it's like, you need to be strong. He's always been the one telling me to be strong, and that was one of the first things he told me when this started coming. Is like, you're gonna have to be strong. So I always hear that in my mind.
Need to take Sabbath rest.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Sabbath is important. I want to give one more commercial for something I'm trying to do that I heard someone say, that in our vulnerable community in the Clark County area, we need to not only give food, we need to give disposable masks that we can get in the hands of our vulnerable community, that they have access to those. I mean, it's nothing for me to go and buy a $6 pack of 3-ply 10 face masks, but that's what I'm going to encourage Sunday school classes and others as they're considering doing stuff. I'm saying,
that's
make
good.
sure when you give contributions, do you guys give contributions to ACTS?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, because you're in Oconee. Your Friendship is Oconee, right?
We are,
and of course, Watkinsville is
right on the Oconee-Clark line, but we're on the Oconee side. Yeah. Right.
And we're really close to the East Athens side, and we actually live in Athens, and my church is in Watkinsville. Right. But still, ACTS needs this. Yeah. My son has some homeless friends that he's taking things to, and I said, you need to take these packs and give them out for their safety. And that's one way we can support you, is to try for us to stay as healthy as we can. Yeah. And to do that. Anyway, I've spoken enough. Yeah. I just want to say thank you. Yeah, I was going to say we need to wrap up. We've gone just a little over time. Amy, thank you so very much for joining us tonight. We're just very grateful for your time. I'm looking at the clock. I'm seeing it's actually 5:41 in the afternoon where you are. So you still have a good bit of the rest of the day to
time to make dinner.
Go have dinner or something. But
some of us are going to watch the debates.
Yeah, I was going to say.
All right. Time to pop popcorn. Sorry.
Good idea.
Right.
Yeah.
But,
One thing,
good
if
to
I
hear
could just
people-
make one comment.
yeah, Maurice. Yeah.
Because the one thing about science, it's like there's no, in a foxhole, there's no atheist. And a lot of these people who don't believe in science, when they go to the hospital, it's going to be science that saves them, and they won't turn it down. Now, there are some people, of course, that will not
Yeah.
take children or go to a hospital and have it.
Religious,
Right.
religious groups do that, but yeah.
Cure them.
Mhm.
But God helps them who helps themselves.
Amen. Amen.
And you
Yes.
can't yell fire in a crowded theater. And that is my opinion of people who don't wear masks.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well said. Well said.
Well, it's certainly good to be with you all, and it's good to hear people who sound like I do. I don't get as much of the accent out here in the Bay Area, so.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and wrap this up then. Again, Amy, thank you so very much. Very grateful, and I look forward to following up with you afterwards.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, good night, everybody.
Good night. Good night.
Thanks, Tom.
All right.
Hug your wife for me. We
I
really
will
do
gladly
need to get
do.
together one of these days. We
I
really
look-
do need to get together again. Make
look-
sure you tell your congregation about our Thanksgiving service. One of the aspects will be on our healthcare workers, the compassionate community.
Okay.
So,
Okay, great. Great. We'll do.
All
We'll
right.
do.
all right. Good
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.